Hi everyone. Um, it's public holiday in Switzerland, so today we can talk during normal working hours as opposed to evenings, as I usually do my broadcasts. Let's quickly check the technology. If you're watching this and you can see me properly, please write in comments where you're watching from, and I'll check the technology. They're promising me that LinkedIn is now working amazingly and is completely integrated. Let's see if that's true. Please write something in the comments if you watch, and then I'll see if I can register, and I'll check the technology. Carlo, thank you. Philip, thank you. Okay, great. Zakniko, thank you, thank you. Excellent. I can see some comments. Okay, so technology is working with a slight delay. That's fine. I today I wanted to I try to do these broadcasts every Wednesday night, but I've had so many board meetings lately, and I have so much papers to prepare for them that I completely swamped over and wasn't able to meet my side of the commitment. So sorry about that. But today is a public holiday, and I wanted to have this chat with you, and I wanted to talk about 4 lessons I personally learned from the coronavirus. But something amazing happened. COSO gave me a little present, gave us all a wonderful present. They published this wonderful guide called Understanding and Communicating Risk Appetite. And it was too good of an opportunity not to comment on the document. So I thought, well, I actually went through the document this morning, a little bit higher level. Like, I didn't read every single word in the documents, but I've studied it enough. And I highlighted some of the important messages. I highlighted in yellow what I think are decent, good messages, and I highlighted in red what is absolute rubbish. Now, it's interesting to see, it's always with COSO, it's always interesting to kind of do the homework and check who the authors are. It's written by Larry Rittenberg and Frank Martins. I've checked both of them. Larry is the audit committee chair, and his background on LinkedIn is very brief, but I sense that he used to work at EY. And Frank is an ex-PwC partner. I don't think he worked anywhere except PwC until recently going solo. So, yeah, interesting start. 2 consultants are going to tell us how to make sense of risk appetite. So I'll talk you through some of the messages, and then I'll share my story. Quick kind of overview, and by all means, the technology is working. I can see all the comments. Share your thoughts, ideas. You don't have to agree with anything I say. Contradict me, correct me, and ask questions in the comments. I would love to kind of have a conversation with you while I talk through this document. And then as soon as I finish with this COSO document, I'll talk through the 4 lessons that I personally learned from coronavirus, and how those 4 lessons will be very important for my children's pension. So we shall see. First kind of overall message on this COSO risk appetite document. It had an unexpected consequence. The concept of risk appetite, I mean, it's been a painful concept for a long time. I've written 3 articles on this, and by the way, if you haven't seen it, make sure you check out the blog on riskacademy.blog, where I have 400 articles on different topics, but I have 3 on risk appetite. If you just search for risk appetite on the blog, you'll see that kind of how my thinking has evolved, because I have like risk appetite, risk appetite is complete BS, then risk appetite reimagined, and then risk appetite reimagined 2.0. And even then, I still wasn't kind of it still didn't quite register. I didn't have the full piece of, like the full puzzle didn't really fit together. And after reading, so unintended consequences, after reading this COSO document, I think it finally became completely clear, like crystal clear to me, what risk appetite should be all about. And the funny thing is, it's the complete opposite of what the COSO writes about. So this is going to be fun, and you can judge which one, which version is closer to your kind of thinking. All right, I don't know if you can see this properly on your screen. If you can't, sure. Philip is asking blog. It's very easy, riskacademy.blog. But listen, ever since I created Risk Academy 7 or 8 years ago, it kind of became a big thing. So if you just literally Google for Risk Academy, it's number one on YouTube, number one on Google. So it's easy to find. It should be easy to find. All right, now I've made the highlights. If you can't see them, try making your video full screen, and I'm going to read through all of the kind of points anyway. So don't feel bad that you can't see the wording. So first point: how much risk is acceptable in pursuit of objectives? I mean, that is a good point that they make in the executive summary. Let's see if they can kind of deliver with some practical application on that, because that's the ultimate goal: is how much risk is acceptable for the management to pursue the objectives that the owners or the board members or the regulators set them. And then it immediately goes into explaining, what is risk appetite. Risk appetite is the amount of risk on a broad level an organization is willing to accept in pursuit of value. And this is kind of the first point where I think they're beginning to kind of completely miss the plot. Risk appetite is not really a singular. It's not an amount of risk. It's not something that is measurable or quantifiable or tangible. Amount of risk. There's no such thing as amount of risk. There are rather, and you will understand what I mean by this. There are rather two things. There are limitations that are set or imposed on the company, and there's attitude towards risk. And both of those things combined, I mean, you can technically, this is what they do. They technically call it risk appetite, but you really shouldn't, because it confuses the message. Risk appetite is definitely not about an amount of risk. They kind of claim that on the broad level, so it could mean that's the typical consulting bullshit talk. That could mean absolutely anything. But let's see if this is just the executive summary. Let's see if the detail behind it is actually is actually explained in detail in the body of the document. Simon is saying risk appetite is fluid and ever-changing subject. Well, I mean, let's see if we are on the same page, because that statement by itself is pretty vague. I on the other hand, mean something extremely simple and tangible, and I will unravel this as we go through the document. So then the next message that kind of stood out as weird to me: when a board considers a strategy, it should determine whether that strategy aligns with the organization's risk appetite. And this is, I think, this is where the authors are completely missing the plot. It's not the way the document is structured, and the way it kind of implies is that the board should set the risk appetite as some sort of kind of guideline, and then benchmark everything they do against that guideline. And in some instances that's true, but it's not really the board that sets the guidelines. It's the guidelines are imposed usually by creditors or regulators. But then there's so much more to risk appetite that they're completely missing from this discussion. So just keep in mind that this sentence, where the strategy aligns with organization's risk appetite, is actually completely wrong. It's actually the opposite. And I will explain I will explain later. By the way, some background to research some of the things that I will be talking about, because essentially, the concept of making risk-reward balanced decisions, that concept is not new by any stretch of the imagination. And in fact, there's a whole science, it's called decision science, that provides a lot of practical application. It's used by military, NASA, Intel, Chevron, Shell. It's used by some of the kind of largest corporations, the ones that excelled at decision making under uncertainty, or risk-based decision making, or probabilistic decision making. You can call it any way you like. But the idea is that you really you have to research the background on decision science to understand many of the things I will talk about later, and many of the conclusions I make why this document is actually the very opposite of good practice. Because, for example, write in the comments, please, who has heard or who is familiar with the concept called efficient frontier? And please write in the comments, have you heard it? Or if you've never heard it, again, it's not a big drama. Just please write, because I want to see some interaction. Write in the comments if you have or have never heard about the concept called efficient frontier. If you haven't, keep in mind that efficient frontier is the real application, the real practical application, real practical application of risk appetite. And if you've never heard, the name or the concept is, research it, because that's what risk appetite should look like. And this is the opposite of what the guys in the COSO document are sharing with us. So thank you. I can now see your comments. Thank you very much for sharing. If you heard about it and you're familiar with the science of decision making, and you're familiar with probability theory, then everything I will continue saying from now on will be very familiar and simple for you to understand, because the ideas are 100 years old. If you have never heard, and thank you very much for your honesty, for the people that share that they have never heard it, please research it, because that's what risk appetite really looks like when you don't try to bullshit your executives, but you're actually trying to do something useful. So next comment. When properly communicated, risk appetite guides management in setting goals and making decisions so that organization is more likely to achieve its goals. Now, this statement I completely agree with. Risk appetite is the driving force to help management choose this right risk-reward balance for many decisions, as well, and this is very important, it's actually the the guideline for setting the objectives, for setting the goals, for setting the strategy, for choosing the strategic direction. Then it goes into saying ERM is not isolated from strategy planning, day-to-day decision making. Sure, I mean, risk management is integral part to decision making. No, it is about compliance. Now, I just highlighted this because I thought it was hilarious, because literally everything going forward will be about compliance. There's nothing about decision making in the true sense of decision making, because if you open a textbook on decision making, you will see the opposite of what the authors are saying here. If you open the book on ERM, which is all compliance rubbish, then you will see exactly what it says here in the document. So I just thought it was hilarious how they, every time COSO claims it's not about compliance, but then they don't know what practical application of risk concepts is. So they always fall back into this compliance mindset. And then this is another absolutely important point, and let me even make it a little bit bigger. Decision makers must know how much risk is acceptable as they consider ways of accomplishing objectives. No, they do not. That is literally the opposite of truth. I will show you how what's the better way of doing that. Decision makers, in fact, may not know, may have no idea what the right level of risk is. In fact, there is no right level of risk is, because if you're familiar with the concept of efficient frontier, it's actually by definition telling you that there are always multiple correct decisions, and it's all about making the selection for the most appropriate risk-reward balance, or the kind of the uh, risk appetite of the decision makers at the time of making the decision. So this whole idea that you set risk appetite up front and then you kind of manage the company against that appetite, that is actually complete nonsense. It is literally the opposite of truth, with the exception, and I'll explain that a little bit later. There are some risk appetites that are imposed on the company, and then they become the kind of the goalposts where you have to stay within the goalposts. And then everything else, for the other 95% of the time, it's not about setting the risk appetite and then benchmarking against it. So let's continue and see what other clever ideas are they proposing. So develop, and then this is still executive summary, but it gives a good overview of the document. So they're basically proposing there are 3 steps: develop risk appetite, communicate risk appetite, monitor and update risk appetite. Nothing could be further from the truth, but let's kind of go step by step. Management and the board must make choices in setting risk appetite, understanding the trade-offs involved in having higher or lower risk appetites. That is so. I'm going to make a lot of different points, and I will try to kind of communicate them in the most structured way without overly confusing you. So the first premise that the document is saying is that management should set risk appetite and then make everybody understand it. That is not true. In fact, there are 2 applications of risk appetite. Application number 1, risk appetite is imposed. It's not something that the management, for example, the management doesn't need to discuss that they have 0 tolerance for safety risks, or they have a 0 tolerance for selling to countries under sanctions or companies under sanctions, or they have 0 tolerance for corruption, because the regulators already set that benchmark. I mean, the management can discuss whatever they want. They're still going to be fined if the regulator finds out. Especially US companies, they're governed all over the world for anti-corruption sanctions. They have some of the most strictest regimes around that. So a lot of the risk appetites, a lot of the kind of limits are imposed on organizations. And the funniest thing is, they have been imposed much longer than the concept of risk appetite existed. So the first premise is that you should set risk appetite. That is absolutely not true. Most of the appetites for different kinds of risks are set by default for the companies willing to operate in a certain jurisdiction. As soon as you enter a jurisdiction, those limits or those appetites, call it whatever, they're imposed on you already. So that's the first thing. It's not about setting, it's about understanding what has been imposed on the company from external regulators and stakeholders. And then the second one, all the business management. So it's not all about 0 tolerances. Some of the risk appetites are all about avoidance, and those are usually set by external parties, and it's all about understanding them and making sure that the company kind of stays within the legal limits. Calling that risk appetite seems a bit of a waste for me, because all of that kind of existed forever. I actually remember the first time I came across the concept of risk appetite. I think it was in 2005, and it was a marketing brochure by Oliver Wyman. And my hypothesis is that they actually came up with this concept, and so they're some of the biggest bullshit vendors on the planet, pushing those marketing concepts, and head off to them for managing to make this global practice that we now have to discuss with it. Because I mean, every company on the planet would have been just as successful or unsuccessful without the concept of risk appetite ever existing. But so the first premise is that you have to set risk appetite. No, you don't. It's kind of enforced for zero tolerances and non-compliances. And then the second part of it, so the risk appetite is basically two pools. One is non-compliances, zero tolerances, everything that is imposed. But then the second one, that's the most important one, where 95 of the business decisions are made, and it's all about risk-reward balance. And these appetites are not set. In fact, they are discussed and analyzed at the time of making decision. And I will explain. At the moment, I'm sure this is absolutely meaningless to you, but I will try and explain this in a little bit more detail. Later. Lamre is asking a weird question. I don't understand why regulators will impose risk appetite on an organization. Please paraphrase your question, because I don't understand it. Why regulators? Because that's their job, to regulate. And that's why we have safety regulations. That's why we have anti-bribery guidelines. That's why we have sanction lists and specific regulators looking after that. I mean, that's their job. The companies operate in a highly regulated environment from different aspects, and all of those imply limitations. The other external limitation that most companies have is, of course, covenants, bank covenants, and rating agency rules for having a certain tranche of credit rating. So there are limits imposed on what the debt to EBITDA should look like, how much EBITDA there should be, how much leverage there should be. All of those limitations are externally enforced, and they're all technically risk appetite. Thank you, Vinod. I just read your comment. I agree. So again, let me repeat that first premise, which is actually not true in the document, and in fact, it's very different in reality. Risk appetite, there are two types. One is imposed on the company. It's either your bank telling you that your debt to EBITDA should be 3.7 or 4 or 5 or 2. And once they tell you that and you sign the loan agreement where you agree to that limitation, that becomes your risk appetite for future investments. That becomes a very limiting factor in everything you do. As well as you can't sell to countries under sanctions, you can't buy from companies under sanctions. All of those limitations are imposed. But then the second group is all about making risk-reward trade-offs when making decisions. And this is what risk appetite practically is all about. It's about making risk-reward trade-offs when making decisions. And this is where the concept of efficient frontier comes in, and I'll come back to it a little bit later. So that's the first premise. So they're saying we should set the risk appetite, we should develop it, and then we should kind of work towards that risk appetite, or work within the boundaries of that risk appetite. Not true. That is absolutely not the way the businesses should be done, with the exception of this first bucket, which is all compliance. Now, here's the second premise, that incorrect premise that this document is making. So the reality is, in fact, the opposite. They're saying the first is to create an overall risk appetite statement that is broad enough, yet descriptive enough, blah, 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 blah. The second is to communicate risk appetite, and the third is to communicate risk appetite for different categories. So they're saying have a broad overall risk appetite statement, then have specific appetites for each objectives, and then have a separate risk appetite for different categories of risk. Second and third are not that important at the moment, but the first point is completely missing the kind of the right way of thinking about risk appetite. The idea to create some sort of risk appetite statement is absolute nonsense. It's literally the opposite of good risk management. Because if we've just talked about those two buckets of risk appetite, so first one is imposed, and first one is zero tolerance to health and safety incidents of death, or large production facility incidents. Well, before the risk appetite concept appeared, surely this notion that the company has low tolerance for safety and security risks has been documented somewhere. Write in the comments, where do you think the tolerance has traditionally been documented for health and safety risks? And it's always been there for, I don't know, for the last 50 maybe years, long before the whole concept of risk appetite existed. And keep asking questions as well. So first my question to you. What's the opposite of having a standalone risk appetite statement? Where normally do we document all of those external requirements that are imposed on the organization? Where would we document the fact that we don't sell to countries under sanctions? Where would we document that we generally try to be in compliance with laws and regulations? The authors are suggesting that we should document it in the risk appetite statement, but that of course is stupid, because it has always been documented. And Vinod is, thank you for your comment, you're correct. Most organizations have health and safety policy that is available, but literally, like, go on any company's website, go to corporate governance section, and you will see their anti-corruption, anti-bribery, health and safety policies. And most of them actually quite explicit in what the risk appetite is. So the second premise, which is not true in real life, is that you don't have to create separate documents to document risk appetite, because most of the risk appetites, I'm more than happy to hear exceptions and discuss the exceptions in the comments. But yes, Jamie, Rina, you're all right. You're all correct. I worked for sovereign funds in the past a lot, and they all had investment guidelines. Investment guideline is some sort of high-level, board-level document which sets out the mandate, the strategy, kind of the principles, the ideas. And of course, it would say something like, we would seek moderate returns with moderate level of risk. And then in the brackets, it would say, we would accept volatility of no more than 8 or 10%. They would have some sort of quantifiable measure of what their appetite for risk is. And that's absolutely fine and useful inside existing documents. So the second premise that I think the authors are completely clueless about is that you don't have to create any separate documents for risk appetite, because existing company policies already have appetites for different kinds of decisions. And it's in the right place, because what happens with every risk management document when we try to create a separate specific document for risk? For example, what happens when you create a risk management framework document? So that document that outlines that you have to identify, assess, mitigate, and monitor. Sorry, the process is so silly. I even forgot the forgot the sequence. What happens when you create all of this in a single document, in a wonderful document, and you call it risk management framework, and then you pretend that everyone in the organization is supposed to read it, but nobody does? The only people that ever read risk management framework documents are external auditors, internal auditors, and the risk manager who wrote it, which is kind of fun, because at the very beginning of the document, it says, this document is intended for everyone in the organization to use to manage risks appropriately. And I always think this is absolutely hilarious, because if you really wanted to manage risks appropriately, you would take the procurement manual and you would write the requirements to analyze the risks of the supplier and the actual goods supplied inside the procurement process. Or you would take the investment guidelines and you would make it a requirement for every investment that is done that NPV is calculated using a probabilistic approach, or a stochastic approach, and you get a range of possible values instead of a single point NPV and IRR and MIRR calculation. So I thought that was funny. And again, COSO is making exactly the same mistake here. They are implying that we should create a separate document for risk appetite, when in fact, most of those appetites that have been imposed on the organization have always been documented in existing documents. Next, let's continue. Articulating risk appetite is too difficult. Risk is considered when the management sets strategies, and to further communicate risk appetite. Yeah, sorry, I don't remember. I don't remember what the comment was there. Doesn't seem like it's valuable. Firm is saying terms and conditions is, I guess, an example where you would document kind of your attitude, your approach to risk. Now, the next section is just overview from COSO, what risk appetite is. I mean, it's not important. This one I thought was hilarious. Overview, it's saying, risk appetite is not a vacuum. There's existing risk profile, risk capacity, risk tolerance, risk attitude. So this to me was the perfect bullshit bingo. Like, if you wanted to come up with some random words which are absolutely meaningless, and all those bad practices in one place, there's kind of, they're grouped all together. It's basically, this is the meaning of this diagram. Take 4 bullshits, combine it, and you'll get one big bullshit. That's the idea. Not very practical. So here's an important point. And remember, so far I've made 2 hypotheses. Hypothesis number 1, risk appetite, you don't set it. It's either implied, or you use the decision maker's appetite for risk at the time of making the decision. Hi, Mark. Good to see you. I remember. How are you? Write something to me. I remember our time in Sydney fondly. And the first premise, the first hypothesis I'm making is that risk appetite is either implied or it's considered at the time of making a decision using an efficient frontier, for example. And the second hypothesis that I'm making is the kind of that I imply is that we don't need a separate set of documents to document that, because risk appetites are already documented in existing policy documents, and we should instead change how we present our decisions to the decision makers to allow them to see more than one choice and choose between the choices using their appetite for risk, because their appetite for risk, or their attitude to risk, I mean, call it whatever, is actually going to change before and after lunch, on a sunny day and on a rainy day, before and after good news, whether the company is doing well or poorly financially, before coronavirus or after coronavirus. All of those things, whether they're hungry or they're not hungry, all of those things will have a huge implication on the appetite for risk for the decision makers. And this is why the concepts like the efficient frontier or simulations, Monte Carlo simulations, are so powerful. And again, if those 2 words are absolutely meaningless to you at this stage, Monte Carlo simulations and efficient frontier, which is kind of, you need one to get to the other. You need to simulate to get to the efficient frontier, or you can run scenarios to get to the efficient frontier. If those 2 words are meaningless to you, please research them, because it is impossible for you to understand or appreciate the power of having this risk-based discussions and making decisions appropriate for the risk appetite of the organization without understanding those two simple but very mathematical concepts. So the premise that the authors are making here is that articulation of risk appetite provides bounds on the choice of strategies and the operational decisions that are made to pursue those objectives. No, that is not true. That is true only in regards to the enforced external risk appetites, something that the regulator or the creditor or the rating agency or the owner of the company imposes on the organization. That sets the bounds. But the bounds, they're actually they're pretty broad. But then within those bounds, it's all about making the right risk-reward trade-off. And this is what risk appetite is all about. It's about making the risk-reward trade-offs. And to that, you don't articulate risk appetite and it doesn't set the bounds. So that statement is actually not useful at all. And then it goes into the steps. How do you adopt, how do you implement it into practice? That's supposedly the idea. And so the management needs to develop and the board review and agree with the view on the overall organization's overall risk appetite. No, that is not true. The regulators and the external parties impose certain risk appetites, and they don't care if the management or the board agrees. That's part of the rules of doing business. And the second is you don't actually have to have an organizational overall risk appetite, nor it is physically possible. Having some sort of statement that you call an overall risk appetite is not particularly useful. And then the next point is this view of risk appetite is translated into written or oral form that can be shared across the organization. No, most definitely it should not. Well, first of all, for all the implied stuff, it's already there, so you don't have to translate anything. It's always been there. It's been there well before some clever consultants decided to sell us this concept of risk appetite. And then for the efficient frontier stuff, you don't really have to communicate across the organization. It's a decision-making tool. That's the opposite of what the authors are talking about. And then management monitors the risk appetite over time, adjusting how it's expressed as business. Again, no, you don't actually have to do it. Those three steps are the very essence of everything that COSO does. It takes something that has been done in place, misses 90. So it takes like risk appetite. Imagine it's like the whole concept is like 100%. They take the 5% that they see on the tip of the iceberg, and then they completely disregard the other 95% of the stuff that they're not familiar with, because they've never really had any exposure to proper decision science or how probabilistic decisions are made. And then they just repackage it into a nice artificial, completely consulting wrapper, and then they sell it to everyone else. Everyone who can't see through their nonsense. So Firman, thank you. You can always watch it on replay on the YouTube. I love this little quote. In the recent survey, less than half of the respondents say they had a formal process for developing and communicating risk appetite. Thank God, because if companies have an actual formal process to do that, that means they're wasting a lot of shareholder resources and being unnecessarily bureaucratic, because that does not help decision making in any shape or form. An organization's risk appetite should be articulated and communicated so that personnel understand what they need to pursue objectives within acceptable limits. I mean, sure, hard to argue with that. I mean, again, if we're talking about 5% of the imposed risk appetites, the company need to understand, the boundaries. The traders and the salespeople need to understand that even though the margins may be very attractive in certain countries under sanctions, we just don't do it as a company. So that's important to understand. Or if some organization chooses to do it, they do it in the way that is legal. I don't know if it's even possible. So anyway, the traders and the salespeople, of course, need to understand that. A risk appetite statement effectively sets the tone for risk management. No, it doesn't. The decision-making, the procedures that outline the decision-making algorithms, the manuals, the business processes that outline how decisions, important material and uncertain decisions are being made, that's what sets the tone for risk management. Risk appetite should be descriptive enough to guide actions across the organization. Yeah. Management and the board should determine whether compensation incentives are aligned with risk appetite. Again, this is the opposite of what the management should actually be doing, and I will maybe this is kind of the step where I'll try and explain it. Because the opposite of this is what the authors are proposing is you set the risk appetite, then you do your business decision making, and you try and match the two. That is not actually useful at all. That's the bad risk management 1 approach. In risk management 2, we learn something very very important. And by the way, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, what is risk management 1 and risk management 2, literally Google RM1 versus RM2. There's a whole article explaining why there's a fundamental difference between ERM and decision science. Risk management 1 is ERM, decision science is RM2. And in risk management 2 or decision science, we do something completely different. We appreciate that uncertainty plays a huge part in any kind of decisions, especially important material decisions about the future. The future is uncertain, and the degree of uncertainty always varies. Some uncertainties are greater, some uncertainties are smaller, but the future is always uncertain. So it's impossible to represent future as a single point estimate. It's always a range. If it's high uncertainty, it could be a huge range. If it's low uncertainty, it's a small range. But the future is always represented as a range. And in risk management, that's our competency. That should be our competency. Unfortunately, it isn't for many in the profession. But our competency is to mathematically estimate what this range is, whether it's big, small, what the range is. So when we apply risk management to objective setting or strategic choices, we actually do two of the things. First, it's all about choosing the right direction, choosing the right strategy. And as you can imagine, for any organization, there are multiple strategies to choose. There are, in fact, multitude of possible directions that the company may take, and each of those directions varies in terms of the cost involved and the risk involved and the value that it will generate. And that's why when we want to apply risk appetite properly, we don't actually set the risk appetite and then monitor, measure or benchmark our chosen strategy against it. No, we actually use something called an efficient frontier, where we plot all of the possible choices, all of the possible combinations of investment projects, all of the possible combinations of different strategic decisions. We plot them on the same graph, and we've mathematically determined what the efficient frontier is. An efficient frontier is an area, kind of a line on which all of the choices are good choices. The only difference is that they have different risk-reward balances. So they're good choices. They provide a good balance between risk and reward, but that balance is different. And this is where risk appetite kicks in. Instead of having a separate risk appetite discussion and then having a strategic goals or objectives discussion, what should instead happen is when presenting all the strategic options, they should be represented as risk-reward trade-offs. And the management and the board and the owners at the time of making the decision should be selecting from the options along the efficient frontier. That's I don't do the justice to the concept. Research it, and there are textbooks written about how to do it properly. Plus, on the Risk Awareness Week, and let me share quickly, the replays are still available at 2019 Risk Awareness Week, and you can watch any 3 replays for free, so they don't miss that opportunity. On that session, we actually have Brian Putt, an ex-decision scientist from Chevron, explaining, like literally showing step by step how he calculates the efficient frontier in Excel. So I highly recommend that practice. And he will do something very similar at the 2020 Risk Awareness Week, which will be this October. So don't miss it. And by the way, write something in the comments, because I feel a little bit lonely here. Send me some questions, suggestions. Maybe share some of your experiences where you've used efficient frontier for decision making. So when making the choices should be made using risk-reward balance, and this is what risk appetite is all about. But then once the choices are made, we need to set measurable goals, objectives, and this is where risk management 2 kicks in as well, because when we do any kind of objective setting or goal setting or forecasting, we do it in ranges. So instead of a single objective that, for example, we need sales of 100 million. That's the deterministic, that's the risk management 1 approach of doing that. In risk management 2, we would actually have this KPI, the sales, as a probabilistic distribution that will tell us that the mean value is probably somewhere between, somewhere around 85, and then the 95th percentile is 120, and then the 5th percentile is somewhere around 40, for example, in sales. And that will give us the ranges to create management incentives based on percentiles, as opposed to some sort of abstract concept of risk appetite. So anyone who has been using probabilistic approach to decision making or to goal setting or to business planning or forecasting, to us, this is kind of normal practice. We do everything in ranges, we forecast in ranges, we use stochastic analysis to give us the distribution, and then the different percentiles, it could be the 80% confidence interval, the 90% confidence interval, that gives us the kind of the risk appetite for a particular goal. So this again is kind of the opposite of what the authors are suggesting. And if you can, my overall message is, if you want to learn about risk appetite, go read a book on decision science as opposed to reading anything that COSO publishes. This one I thought was kind of funny. One company ignored many health and safety regulations and fines when incurred, but it did not fully understand the magnitude of risks, such as government shutting down its operations. I mean, this is just overly naive. Any organization that operates is very, very clear about the implications of unsafe behavior. Like there are no surprises. It's just many organizations actively choose to ignore it. It's don't pretend they didn't know that the government may shut down operations because of horrible safety records. That is not a surprise. That's ignorant and illegal behavior. So I don't think having a risk appetite statement in an organization that completely disregards fines and safety regulations is going to solve anything. So let's not pretend. That I thought was a little bit too much. Then they give a little bit more examples of what risk appetite statement may look like, and this is pretty useless stuff. It doesn't actually generate value. The best risk appetite you can document is have a look at existing board level policies and see if the limits imposed by external parties or the need to make decisions based on a risk-reward balance are properly communicated in the in those existing policies. Don't waste your or board's time on a separate document. And here's another example. This is kind of funny, because as soon as the conversation turns to financial services, because financial services had all of this in place well before the whole concept of risk appetite became fashionable, it makes total sense. For example, a financial institution has a loan impairment losses should not exceed 0.25 of their portfolio. That's a typical KPI, like that's a normal KPI for a business. I don't understand why they would want to call it a risk appetite. It's just it's part of it's a normal KPI for credit department, and that's just normal business. They always kind of approach this. They always attempt to. I mean, COSO and other consultants. I mean, everyone is kind of doing the same thing. They always attempt to take existing good practices that were always there, and they just give it a new, fashionable, and sexy name, which I don't think is fair or justified. Let's have a look at another comment. So then they start talking about risk tolerances. Risk tolerances guide operating units as they implement risk appetite within their sphere of operation. Risk tolerances communicate a degree of flexibility, and this is kind of my first premise that I started with was that it's really not about risk appetite and setting risk tolerances. No, it's about making. Let me rephrase that, because for anyone who has never seen how efficient frontier looks like, or how a kind of risk-reward portfolio analysis looks like, it will be very difficult to understand. Risk appetite is not about setting limits and then sticking within those limits, with the exception of imposed external stuff that is required by law. That's 5% of the time. 95% of the time, risk appetite is not about setting limits or imposing something. It's about making risk-reward trade-offs transparent. It's about giving the decision makers choice, giving them mathematical choice between option A and option B, comparing option A and option B, project A and project B, not just on the basis of NPV or some other metric that ignores uncertainty, but rather as comparing two sets of distributions, almost putting the distributions one on top of the other and saying, well, risk adjusted, which one gives us the better value? And risk appetite conversations in reality is all about having those transparent discussions around how much risk can we take for the value that we perceive. And the only way you can do it is not by setting risk tolerances and risk appetites and documenting it in the risk appetite statement. No, the only way you can do it is by simulating uncertainty, providing distributions, and or running scenarios and giving multiple options for the decision makers to choose based on their current risk appetite. Risk appetite of the decision, and different decision makers at the board and the management level have different appetites for risk as their personality, and they also have different appetites for risk before and after lunch. And it's not about taking the right amount of risk. It's about giving the decision makers the choices to choose what level of risk they feel comfortable with. For example, when I did this 7 years ago, I brought to the executives, they had a strategy, and our risk analysis showed that there was 3% probability of successfully achieving that strategy. And they said, no, this is not good enough. This is not the strategy we feel comfortable selling to our shareholders. So they've made a number of changes to the assumptions. They've made a number of changes to the strategy. And the final strategy had the probability of being achieved 70%. So that means 30% of the time that we have simulated, the strategy is still going to fail. And they said, well, this is what we feel comfortable with. This is within our kind of collective appetite for risk. They didn't have to document it in the risk appetite statement. They felt, they knew at the time when they looked at different options that this was what they were comfortable with. And in fact, If I was to do exactly the same again today, I probably wouldn't even just give them one distribution saying what's the probability of not achieving the strategy. I would actually calculate an efficient frontier with multiple strategic options and show them that if you this is the kind of, if you choose this portfolio of initiatives or projects, that will give you uh, the kind of the most balanced risk-reward relationship, and allow them to choose between those 2 or 3 different options along the efficient frontier. Then they give some examples from a university and some other company of risk appetite statements. And this is, I mean, this is pretty typical stuff. So they take all of those imposed tolerances that the company would have had anyway in all of the every single sentence here. If you were to look at the existing policies, you would see something along the lines, and some of the things would have been kind of explicit. Low tolerance related to financial reporting quality. Sure. That I don't remember. This is a good table, but it's kind of it's funny. I'm guessing this is taken out of some sort of other context, because I cannot imagine the authors of all of the previous texts writing this stuff, because these are examples of kind of quantifiable risk tolerances. While we expect a return of 18% of this investment, we're not willing to take more than 25 chance that the investment leads to a loss of more than 50% of our existing capital. That statement is extremely easy to make once you've run 10,000 simulations using Monte Carlo on the NPV on the financial model that calculates the NPV for the project. I mean, those are exactly the statements that I would usually put in the board paper or in any kind of discussion when I try to communicate risks. To get to this statement is impossible without proper mathematics, without proper risk analysis. Nothing in all of the previous however many pages, nothing in the previous 13 pages even hinted that the authors have any idea on how to do this. And in fact, they were saying statements that are completely contradictory to what it implies in the statement. And also, this is also very interesting. The executives would never have this discussion beforehand. They would never sit down and say, okay, so do we want 25% chance of losing more than 50% of our capex? Or should we make it 35% chance of losing 47% of our capex? That is not the discussion that would ever happen. I mean, this is just fairy tale math. However, once you've taken in the assumptions, you've added volatility, you've run the simulation, you have your distribution of NPV of IRR, for example. So this just talks about distribution of IRR. Once you have that, you would be able to communicate that the median of our 10,000 simulated trials is 18%, and there is a 25% probability that this investment may lose 50% of its capex. That's the conclusion you would make from proper risk analysis, but it's not the risk appetite discussion people would have before you do the risk analysis, because you would do the risk analysis anyway. And in fact, you would use the efficient frontier to show how different project options increase or decrease the probability of losing money, or increase or decrease. In fact, you would have IRR on y-axis and risk volatility on x-axis, and you would have the efficient frontier of all the different potential project options on how to deliver the project in the right balance between risk and reward. So I know this is super confusing, and I apologize for that, but bear with me. I hope my underlying message is I really hope you will now go and research what efficient frontier is, because this is what real risk management is all about. And COSO will never tell you that this is what risk management is all about, because they've never seen good risk management in their lives. Now, next statement, we will not accept more than 5% risk that a new line of business will reduce our operating earnings by more than 5%. Again, this is a statement very easy for me to make if I've done the calculations. Without the calculations, it's impossible to make. Same with this. Emergency room patients within 2 hours and critically ill patients within 15 minutes. I can very easily model that and create a model and simulate whether this is actually achievable, not achievable. And this 5% of the time, this is your 95th percentile that you can easily calculate, and that is impossible to do without math, without proper math. Same here. All of this is super simple to calculate using Monte Carlo simulation, but this is the opposite of what the rest of the document talks about. And then, so this is just the final point that I want to make. And by the way, ask questions if you still have questions on this. They talk about, well, so how do you communicate this, and how do you develop the risk appetite? And it goes, facilitated discussions. No, bullshit. That's not how it's done. It's imposed. Most of the risk appetites are imposed, and then you should change the way decisions are presented, so you can actually make the risk-reward trade-off discussion at the time of making the decision, not as a separate risk appetite discussion. Discussions related to objective and strategies. Again, there's no you can't discuss unless you've properly simulated your objectives and strategies and you've presented them mathematically as ranges. And then normally what happens is you would take the median as the base case, and then you maybe take 75th percentile as the kind of good case, and 25th percentile as the cutoff for any kind of bonus payments. Or maybe I'm a little bit optimistic. Maybe you would take 80th percentile as the base case, and then anything above 80% is extra bonus. Anything below 80 and 60% percentile is kind of the still kind of half bonus area. So this is not the way to do it. And then the final one, develop a performance model. Again, they just throughout the text they imply that only financial services can do it because it's too complicated and mathematical. But that's actually the only way for organizations to have a proper risk-reward trade-off conversation. And the fact that they've just kind of side mention this instead of making this the focus just tells you about the level of competencies. I thought this was funny. A set of questions. I mean, I can kind of imagine some boards even enjoying those conversations because they're just absolutely pointless and harmful. They're just they're just soft and fuzzy conversations. I mean, not our board. And I mean, I would be crucified for even attempting to have that conversation because it's such a useless bullshit that it is ridiculous. And then performance models, they talk about that this is super difficult and only some financial organizations can do it. I thought it was funny how they talk about economic capital, how the management decides it, but it's actually imposed by the regulators. And this section is how you should be doing proper risk appetite calculations. And then the final section on communication. So this is completely wrong. Broad risk appetite statement? No, definitely not. The opposite of that is having risk appetites within existing documents. And then second, risk related to organizational objectives? God, no. Instead, you have objectives presented as probabilistic ranges, and you take 80th or 70th percentile and 90th percentile as your range, and you use that range as base, bonus plus, bonus minus. No, this horrible picture, I don't know what that is. That is just ridiculous. Categories of risk, absolutely not. Absolute waste of time. And I think this is really, yeah, this is really it that I wanted to talk about. So happy to hear your thoughts. I have one. I know it's a little bit late, and I'm rushing off to join another session soon. But quick questions, shoot through in the comments. I'll try and answer them, and I promise that I'll tell you 4 things, 4 lessons I personally learned from coronavirus, and then something that I want to use. Marco is asking, what do you think is this document helping organizations? Can you, Marco, can you please rephrase the question, because I don't immediately understand what you're asking. Is this document helping organizations to improve their risk resilience? This document on risk appetite? No, it's doing the opposite. It's creating additional level of bureaucracy. It's killing any kind of trust in the risk management as a powerful decision-making tool. It is literally the opposite of helping risk managers help organizations make better decisions. It's yet another waste of time that I, as the risk manager, have to combat to actually do proper decision making. Vinod is asking, given the fluid dynamic markets, can we expect management to adhere to risk appetite? Well, let me kind of repeat the overall message. There's no risk appetite. Risk appetite is just marketing nonsense that COSO and Oliver Wyman and some other consultants have came up with. It's absolute rubbish. It doesn't exist. What does exist is the limits imposed by external stakeholders. Laws, regulations, credit limits, all of those things, the banks, the rating agencies, all of those things, they don't particularly care whether it's fluid times or not, or dynamic times. If there's a law that you don't kill people, then you don't kill people. Those limits must be adhered to, and that's the 5% iceberg of risk appetite. The 95% of the under the water iceberg of risk appetite is about making informed decisions. It's about balancing risk reward when making decisions, and this has nothing to do with fluid and dynamic times. So it doesn't, like, the concept doesn't change. All I'm saying is the other 95% of the time is whenever an important decision is presented, it should be presented as multiple choices, and those choices should be probabilistic, and they should be clearly, transparently highlighting the trade-off between reward and risk. And efficient frontier is the mathematical function that you get as a result of the kind of the appropriate balance between risk and reward. And today, more than ever, it is important to have risk as part of the discussion, not as a person sitting on the board, but the concept of uncertainty, having it as part of the discussion, not saying that this project is a good project because it has an NPV of 100 million. Rather, this project could have a range of possible NPVs, and depending on the choices we make, this NPV may actually go up and down, and the risk may actually go up and down. So thank you for the question. Any other questions? Please write in the comments, and in the meantime, I'll share my four lessons. Let me just quickly check. I have a little plan, and I think I've covered everything that I wanted to talk about. But here are my 4 lessons. Number 1, we in the age of this efficiency and cost cutting and re-engineering and optimization, we're really forgetting one of the most fundamental concepts of risk management, and that's building in redundancy. And so lesson number 1 for me is, and I'll have a separate conversation about it on the next podcast, and I'll probably write an article on that as well. I don't feel the companies have learned the lesson at all, but building in redundancy, having more goods than is absolutely necessary, or having more logistical options than absolutely necessary, or having diversified product portfolio than is necessary, even at the cost of reducing profitability, may be a lesson that the business needs to learn, but I'm not sure if it is learning that. The second one is risk-based decision making. And when I say risk-based decision making, I just literally mean is using probabilistic analysis to create decisions or to make decisions where risk and uncertainty is transparent. So showing how uncertainty affects decisions, simulating different possible futures, not choosing between doing something and doing nothing, but always having multiple options to choose and using efficient frontier to select the best options, the best combination of options. The third lesson that I learned is protecting the downside. No matter what happens, we should really be focusing on, and this is kind of part of my job now, is trying to focus on protecting the downside through insurance or some other arrangements where the company is at all the time protected against catastrophic failures. And the final fourth point, which is just for personal life, I think if there was ever time, I mean, this is the time to allocate some risk capital and look for amazing opportunities in the market. I mean, it was more true a month ago, and I've made kind of my investment decisions much earlier than that. But with all the markets kind of down so much, if you ever wanted to invest in your pensions or your children's pension, and you don't speculate and you don't see this as a short-term money-making opportunity, but you just see it as a long-term investment opportunity, I mean, this is an amazing opportunity right now. So I don't see any more questions. Thank you very much for your patience. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts. You can always write and comment on this broadcast, which will be available on YouTube after we finish. And always happy to see you next week when I do another one.